Your hallway is an absolute disgrace, and I cannot fathom how you live in this filth. My mother-in-law Brenda barged through my front door, her voice echoing down the long corridor of my home. She marched straight into my private office, entirely ignoring the glowing green light of my high-definition webcam. She dumped a massive pile of wet, muddy gardening shears directly onto my imported Moroccan rug. She sneered and demanded I thank her for gracing a home my husband supposedly paid for. What she did not know was that I had already muted my microphone and my finger was hovering over the digital button that would permanently delete her security access to the estate I owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set ruthless boundaries with a toxic mother-in-law who tried to claim your success as her own. My name is Jada, and at 35 years old, I run my own highly successful forensic accounting firm. I had spent the entire morning preparing for this exact moment. I was in the middle of a high-stakes video conference with the executive board of a massive corporate client. My presentation was flawless. I was breaking down a complex asset recovery strategy that would secure my firm a seven-figure retainer. My home office was a sanctuary of focus and professionalism. The custom mahogany desk, the soundproofed walls, the hand-woven rug I had imported from overseas to celebrate my first $1 million quarter. Everything was meticulously curated. Then came the violent crash of the front door opening. Brenda did not just walk into a room, she invaded it. She was 60 years old, dressed in her immaculate Sunday suit, wearing her title as the head of the church hospitality committee like a badge of supreme authority. She threw the heavy, solid wood door to my office wide open. Dirt crumbled from the rusted shears in her hands. It fell onto my pristine hardwood floor before she unceremoniously dropped the entire filthy bundle right onto my expensive rug. The wet mud instantly stained the intricate wool fibers. "You really need to hire a better housekeeper, Jada," she announced loudly as she crossed her arms over her chest. "I come over here to check on my son property, and the front entryway is cluttered with your delivery boxes. You should be grateful a woman of my standing in the community even steps foot in a house like this. If it were not for Andre working his fingers to the bone, you would still be sitting in some cramped apartment. A good wife would at least try to maintain the home her husband provides." I stared at her while keeping my face a carefully constructed mask of calm. I could see the tiny squares of my corporate clients on my computer monitor. Some looked confused while others were trying to hide their shock at the sudden intrusion. I slowly reached out and pressed the mute button on my keyboard. Brenda lived in a state of deliberate and unshakable delusion. She absolutely refused to acknowledge that her precious son Andre was merely a junior architect who barely made enough money to cover his own student loans and car payments. This sprawling suburban house, the luxury vehicles in our driveway, the lavish vacations she so happily tagged along on, were entirely funded by my forensic accounting firm. I was the sole breadwinner. I was the owner of the deed. I was the only reason her son lived in complete luxury. But in the rigid mind of Brenda, a woman could never out-earn a man, and certainly not her perfect son. "I am on a corporate call, Brenda," I said. My voice was dangerously low and completely steady. "Pick up that mud and step out of my office right now." Brenda scoffed and placed her hands firmly on her hips. "Do not use that tone with me in my son house. I brought over my old gardening tools so you could finally tackle those unsightly weeds out back. I expected a simple thank you, but I suppose money cannot buy class. Hand me a clean towel so I can wipe my hands." I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a petty argument about whose name was actually on the mortgage document. Arguing with a narcissist is always a profound waste of breath. Instead, I stood up from my leather executive chair. I briefly apologized to my clients in the video text chat, typing that we would take a short 5-minute recess. I turned off my camera. I walked around my heavy desk and stopped just inches away from Brenda. "Hand me your spare key," I said calmly. "Right now." Her eyes widened in genuine shock before narrowing into slits of pure venom. "Excuse me. A mother does not need an invitation to her own son house. I have every right to be here at any time of the day. I am family. You are just the woman he married. You have absolutely no right to kick me out." "You are right," I replied smoothly. "You do not need to give me the physical key." I turned my back on her and walked over to the smart home security panel mounted on the wall near the doorway. I tapped the glowing digital screen to bring up the master user list. I quickly scrolled and found the profile for Brenda. Andre had practically begged me to create that access profile a year ago, so she could supposedly water our indoor plants while we were out of town on business trips. With a single deliberate tap of my finger, I deleted her access code entirely. The panel chimed with a crisp electronic sound, officially confirming her digital eviction from my property. Then I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, dialed a local number, and put the call on loudspeakerphone so Brenda could hear every single word. "Yes, hello, this is Jada," I said clearly over the ringing tone. "I need an emergency residential rekeying for all exterior doors at my address. Someone has compromised the perimeter security, and I no longer feel safe. Yes, I will gladly pay the emergency expedited service fee. How soon can your technician be here?" The dispatcher on the other end confirmed they would arrive within the hour to change every single lock. I ended the call and looked back at Brenda. The color had completely drained from her face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She realized I was not playing games. "You are going to regret this, Jada," she hissed. Her voice was trembling with a potent mixture of rage and deep humiliation. "Wait until Andre hears about how you treat his mother. You think you are so smart with your little numbers and your corporate spreadsheets. You are nothing but a disrespectful brat." She spun on her heel and stormed out of the office. I followed her down the long hallway to ensure she actually left the premises without causing further damage. As she aggressively stomped past the kitchen island, she suddenly reached out and snatched a sealed envelope off the marble counter. It was a piece of my personal business mail, a detailed bank statement I had not yet opened. Before I could demand she put it back down, she shoved the envelope deep into her oversized designer purse. She marched out the front door and slammed it behind her with so much force that the decorative mirrors on the hallway wall rattled against the paint. I took a slow, deep breath and let the quiet peace of the house wash over me. I returned to my office, calmly picked up the muddy gardening shears, and threw them straight into the heavy trash bin. I used a damp microfiber cloth to carefully blot the wet dirt from my beautiful rug. I sat back down at my desk, unmuted my microphone, turned my high-definition camera back on, and flawlessly finished my complex presentation to my waiting clients. We successfully closed the massive contract 20 minutes later. I was just pouring myself a glass of sparkling water to celebrate the victory when my cell phone vibrated across the mahogany desk. It was my husband, Andre. I answered the call, and before I could even say a simple hello, his panicked voice filled the line. "Jada, what in the world is going on? Why is my mom calling me in absolute hysterics?" I frowned and leaned back in my comfortable chair. I told her to leave because she interrupted a vital client meeting and dumped wet mud all over my expensive office rug, Andre. I also permanently deleted her digital access code. I am having a locksmith come over right now to change every physical lock on the doors. He let out a long, frustrated groan. "Jada, you know exactly how she is. You just have to let her do her thing to keep the peace, but that is not even the worst part. Why is she crying and screaming to our relatives that you are trying to steal Greg investment money? What are you talking about?" Greg was the husband of Tasha. Tasha was the younger sister of Andre and the undeniable golden child of the family. Greg was her wealthy, entitled white husband, whom Brenda practically worshipped because of his supposed generational wealth and country club status. I knew exactly why Brenda was trying to drag Greg into this situation. For years, Brenda had held Greg up as the absolute pinnacle of success simply because he came from a family with a recognizable last name. She constantly compared Andre to Greg, subtly putting her own son down, while praising a man who had never actually worked a hard day in his life. She used Greg as a weapon against me at every holiday gathering, bragging about his fictional business ventures to make my legitimate accounting firm look like a little bookkeeping hobby. Now she thought she had found a way to use my own money to fund whatever new scam Greg was cooking up. I have not spoken to Greg in over 4 months, I told Andre firmly. My forensic accountant brain immediately went into rapid overdrive. Did your mother open the piece of mail she took from our kitchen counter on her way out? Andre went totally silent on the other end of the line for a long, tense moment. She told me she found hidden financial documents proving you are hiding massive assets from the family, he finally said. Jada, she is demanding an emergency family dinner this coming Sunday at her house. She says Greg and Tasha are coming over and we need to discuss a very serious financial matter before she takes legal action against you. A cold, brilliant realization settled over my mind. Brenda had not just stolen a random bank statement. She had illegally taken a highly confidential document relating to the private limited liability company I used to manage my discreet personal investments. Those quiet investments included the massive mortgage debt on her own pristine suburban estate. She had absolutely no idea how to read complex financial disclosures properly, but she thought she had finally found the ultimate weapon to use against me. She wanted to wage a full-scale war, and she was bringing Greg and Tasha to the Sunday dinner as her loyal soldiers. She intended to publicly humiliate me and demand money. I looked down at the dark, wet stain still lingering on my Moroccan rug. A slow, calculated smile spread across my face. Tell your mother we will definitely be there on Sunday for dinner, I said softly into the phone. And tell her to make sure Greg brings his entire business portfolio with him. If your mother wants to talk about family money, we are going to put absolutely everything on the table. Sunday afternoon arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat that matched the tension in my marriage. Andre and I drove in complete silence toward his mother house. He nervously tapped his fingers against the leather steering wheel of the luxury SUV I had bought us for our anniversary. We pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of Brenda Pristine suburban estate. The manicured hedges and grand brick facade projected an image of flawless generational wealth. It was the crown jewel of her social standing in the church community. What nobody in that house knew, not even my husband sitting next to me, was that I held the master deed to this very property. 2 years ago, Brenda had been 60 days away from complete foreclosure and public ruin. I quietly bought her debt through my private limited liability company to save her from living on the street. She had been paying rent directly to my holding company ever since, aggressively pretending that the checks were just a management fee for a trust fund. I stepped out of the car wearing a tailored emerald green dress. I looked every bit the ruthless financial expert I was. As soon as Andre unlocked the front door, the heavy scent of roasted lamb and simmering collard greens hit us. But there was no warm greeting. This was not a family dinner. This was a calculated ambush. We walked into the formal dining room, and I immediately saw Tasha and her husband Greg sitting exactly at the head of the long mahogany table. They were positioned like royalty holding court. Tasha was Andre's younger sister and the undisputed golden child of the family. She sat with her arms crossed, wearing a smug smile. Next to her was Greg. He was a white man who came from a family with a recognizable country club last name, a fact Brenda worshipped blindly. Greg leaned back in his chair wearing a wrinkled designer linen shirt he had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card. Before I could even pull out my own chair, Greg slid a cheap, glossy business card across the polished wood table. It stopped right in front of my hands. I looked down at it. It was a card for a discount budget financial planner. I saw your little accounting firm is trying to land bigger clients, Jada, Greg said with a condescending chuckle. But the corporate world is a shark tank. My guy here specializes in helping small bookkeeping hobbies stay afloat when they get in over their heads. Give him a call. He might give you a family discount. I stared at the card and then looked up at Greg. The absolute audacity of this unemployed man trying to give me financial advice was almost comical. Before I could respond, Brenda marched out of the kitchen carrying a silver platter of meat. "Greg is just trying to help you, Jada," Brenda announced loudly as she slammed the platter onto the center of the table. "You should be taking notes. Greg understands real wealth and high-level business networking. It is a shame your little bookkeeping hobby takes up so much of your time. It is clearly holding Andre back from advancing his own career. Now be a useful wife and go to the kitchen to fetch the side dishes while the adults discuss actual business." Andre shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he kept his mouth firmly shut. That was always his survival mechanism. Keep his head down and let his mother run the show to avoid her terrifying temper tantrums. But I was not Andre. I did not move a single muscle. I left the discount business card sitting on the table and calmly picked up my crystal water glass. "If we are having a business meeting, I am perfectly fine right here," I said evenly. "Go ahead, Brenda. The table is all yours." Brenda narrowed her eyes at me, but she was too eager to unveil her master plan to stop now. She took her seat next to Tasha and clinked her fork against her water glass as if she were addressing a crowded banquet hall. "We are here today to discuss family legacy," Brenda began, her voice swelling with dramatic pride. "Greg has spent the last few months developing a revolutionary tech venture. It is going to completely disrupt the digital market. He has the vision and the connections, but to get the initial startup phase off the ground, he needs a small infusion of capital." Tasha reached over and patted Greg's hand affectionately. "It is a guaranteed return on investment," she chimed in. "Greg just needs $250,000 to secure the patent rights and lease the office space downtown." Brenda turned her sharp gaze directly onto my husband. "And that is where you come in, Andre. Family supports family. I expect you to co-sign a commercial business loan for Greg first thing tomorrow morning." Andre choked on his sip of water. He looked at his mother in absolute panic. "Mom, I cannot co-sign a loan for $250,000. I am a junior architect. My salary does not even come close to qualifying for that kind of commercial credit." "You do not need to use your salary," Brenda snapped as if he were being intentionally stupid. "You and Jada own a beautiful, massive home. You have plenty of equity. You will simply use your house as the collateral for the loan. It is a mere formality. Greg will have the business turning a massive profit in 6 months, and the loan will be paid off before you even notice it." I slowly set my water glass down. The sheer delusion echoing in the room was staggering. Brenda was demanding that I put my hard-earned home on the line to fund the delusions of a man who had never held a steady job. Tasha leaned forward and glared at me across the table. "Do not look so stingy, Jada. You and Andre have been married for years and you still do not have any children. You are not paying for daycare or college funds. You have the disposable income and the assets. You owe it to this family to help us build generational wealth since you are clearly not contributing any grandchildren to the bloodline." The room fell dead silent. Andre finally found his spine and slammed his hand on the table. "Tasha, that is completely out of line," he raised his voice. "Do not ever speak to my wife about our personal choices again." But I did not need Andre to defend me. I reached into my designer leather tote bag resting by my feet. I did not yell. I did not scream. I pulled out my digital tablet, tapped the screen to wake it up, and opened the secure file I had compiled the moment Andre told me about this dinner. "If we are talking about using my house to fund a business venture, then I require full financial transparency," I said smoothly. I slid the tablet across the smooth mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Andre, but the bright screen was clearly visible to everyone. "Let us look at the financial portfolio of the man who wants to risk my home," I continued, keeping my voice cold and surgical. "Greg, I pulled your public financial records this morning. Your trust fund was completely frozen by your grandfather estate lawyer 3 years ago due to reckless mismanagement." Greg's face instantly drained of color. He lunged forward to grab the tablet, but Andre pulled it out of his reach. "Let me finish," I said sharply, freezing Greg in his tracks. According to the federal bankruptcy courts, your last 3 brilliant business ventures went completely under. In fact, your luxury car dealership idea left you with a massive tax lien from the federal government. You currently owe the government over $80,000 in unpaid taxes. You do not have a revolutionary tech venture. You are completely broke, drowning in debt, and you are trying to use my flawless credit score to bail yourself out of a federal tax hole. Tasha let out a loud, dramatic gasp. You hacked into his private accounts, she screamed, her face turning a blotchy red. That is illegal, Jada. You are a criminal. Public records are not private, Tasha, I replied calmly. They are freely available to anyone who knows how to look. I am a certified forensic accountant. I track missing millions for a living. Did you really think you could sit at a table, insult my marriage, demand my house, and I would not run a simple background check on your unemployed husband? Greg kicked his chair back with so much force that it crashed to the hardwood floor. He was trembling with humiliation. He refused to look at Andre or Brenda. He grabbed his keys off the table, muttered a string of curses, and stormed out of the front door without another word. Tasha scrambled to her feet, bursting into tears as she ran out right behind him, shouting that I had ruined their lives. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in the dining room. Andre sat completely stunned, staring down at the undeniable proof of fraud on the tablet screen. He looked like a man waking up from a long nightmare. Brenda stood frozen at the head of the table. Her perfect Sunday ambush had just exploded in her face. The golden son-in-law she worshipped had been exposed as a total fraud in front of her. But narcissists do not feel shame. They only feel rage. She slowly walked around the table until she was standing right next to me. Her hands were curled into tight fists. Andre was still too distracted reading the documents to notice his mother leaning down toward my ear. You just made the biggest mistake of your entire life, Brenda hissed. Her voice was a toxic whisper meant only for me. You think you can come into my home, disrespect my daughter, and humiliate the only real man in this family? I will not tolerate this. I have the power to turn my son completely against you. I will make him see what a cold, calculating witch you really are, and I will take my son away from you. You will lose everything. I turned my head slightly and looked directly into her furious eyes. I did not blink. I smiled. She had absolutely no idea the level of warfare she had just invited into her life. We will see about that, I whispered back. The drive home from that disastrous Sunday dinner was suffocatingly quiet. Andre kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He had finally seen his mother for the manipulator she truly was, and the realization had completely drained him. I did not offer him any empty words of comfort. He needed to process the reality of his family on his own. Early the next morning, I packed my bags and boarded a direct flight to Atlanta for a 3-day forensic audit with a major client. I needed the distance, and I assumed the sheer humiliation of having her golden son-in-law exposed as a massive fraud would keep Brenda away from my house for at least a few weeks. I could not have been more wrong. When my flight landed back in the city on Wednesday evening, I was exhausted. I took an executive car service straight home, looking forward to a hot shower and a glass of expensive wine. I rolled my suitcase up the driveway, used my freshly minted set of keys to unlock the heavy front door, and stepped into my foyer. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air in my home felt thick and wrong. The subtle scent of my signature vanilla and cedarwood diffusers had been completely overpowered by the suffocating stench of cheap lavender potpourri. I slowly walked into the main living room and my stomach plummeted. My house had been entirely hijacked. The stunning modern art pieces I had purchased from a local black artist, pieces that perfectly accented our contemporary furniture, were gone. The walls were stripped bare of my taste. In their place hung massive, tacky canvas portraits of Tasha and Greg. There was a giant, glossy photo of them smiling on a sailboat, and another of them holding hands in a perfectly manicured park, strategically placed right above my imported leather sofa. But the absolute worst violation was the sofa itself. For the last 10 years, the only item I kept draped over the back of that sofa was an antique handmade quilt. It was a beautiful, intricate patchwork of deep reds and golds, hand-stitched by my late grandmother. It was my most prized possession, a constant reminder of the strong woman who raised me to be independent. The quilt was gone. It had been replaced by a hideous mass-produced faux fur throw blanket. I dropped my suitcase. The heavy thud echoed through the silent house. Andre walked out of the kitchen holding a glass of water. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. "Where is my grandmother, quilt Andre?" I asked. My voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a cold fury I had never felt before in my life. Andre swallowed hard and refused to meet my eyes. He pointed a shaking finger toward the garage. "She put it in the heavy-duty trash bin outside Jada." "I am so sorry." "She found the emergency lockbox key hidden in the fake rock near the patio. She came over yesterday while I was at work and used it to get inside. When I got home, she was already crying hysterically on the floor." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "Your mother breaks into my home while I am out of town, throws away my priceless family heirloom, and plasters my walls with giant photos of your unemployed brother-in-law, and your response was to let her do it." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of pathetic guilt. "She said the family was completely falling apart after what happened on Sunday. She said she was having chest pains from the stress of it all. She convinced me that the only way to heal the rift was to make the house feel more welcoming for when Greg and Tasha come over to make amends. She said your quilt looked like it belonged in a homeless shelter, and it was ruining the aesthetic of her family. I was just so tired, Jada. I did not have the energy to fight her screaming fits anymore. I thought if I just let her put up a few pictures, she would leave us alone." I did not yell. Yelling implies a loss of control, and I was entirely in control. I turned on my heel, walked straight through the kitchen, and threw open the door to the garage. I ripped the lid off the heavy-duty garbage bin. There, shoved underneath a pile of discarded cardboard boxes, was my grandmother quilt. My hands actually shook as I carefully pulled it out. By some absolute miracle, it was not stained or torn. I folded it tightly against my chest, carried it back into the living room, and placed it safely on the kitchen island. Then I walked into the utility closet and pulled out a massive box of heavy-duty black contractor trash bags. Andre watched in stunned silence as I snapped the first bag open. I marched over to the wall, ripped the giant canvas portrait of Greg and Tasha off the expensive paint, and shoved it directly into the trash bag. The wooden frame snapped under my grip. "Jada, what are you doing?" Andre asked nervously. "I am eradicating a pest infestation," I replied without looking at him. I moved systematically through my own house. I tore down every single tacky picture frame, every cheap vase, every horrifying decorative pillow Brenda had infected my space with. I shoved all of it into the black plastic bags. I did not stop there. I walked into the guest bedroom and found she had completely rearranged the furniture. I dragged everything back to its rightful place. I packed up the cheap potpourri and threw it in the bags. It took me less than 20 minutes to completely erase her presence from my home. When I was finished, I dragged the 4 bulging trash bags out the front door and threw them violently into the trunk of my luxury SUV. I did not say another word to Andre. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove straight to the donation center of a local thrift store. I dumped her entire vision of a perfect family directly into the overnight donation bins. Let some stranger buy her cheap aesthetics for $3. It no longer existed in my world. By the time I returned home, the sun had fully set. Andre was sitting on the edge of our bed, staring blankly at the floor. I ignored him and pulled out my laptop. I did not call a standard locksmith this time. I called the elite private security firm that managed the corporate offices for my accounting firm. I paid a massive premium for an emergency overnight dispatch. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, a team of 3 technicians arrived at my property. Andre watched in quiet bewilderment as they completely dismantled every single traditional lock on the exterior of my home. The front door, the back patio, the garage entrance, and even the heavy door leading to my private home office were all fitted with military-grade biometric fingerprint scanners. There were no more keyholes. There were no more hidden lockboxes under fake rocks. The only way into my fortress was through my specific biological data. I stood in the foyer with the lead technician as he finalized the primary control panel on my phone. "The system is fully operational, ma'am," the technician said politely. "Only you have master administrator rights. You can grant or revoke fingerprint access to anyone at any time from your mobile device. If an unauthorized person tries to force entry or bypass the scanner, it will instantly trigger a silent alarm to local law enforcement and lock down the deadbolts completely." "Thank you," I said, handing him a generous cash tip. "That is exactly what I need." I programmed my own fingerprints into the system. I then called Andre into the hallway and coldly allowed him to scan his right thumb. I made sure he watched me set his profile to a standard user, explicitly demonstrating that I was the one holding the absolute power over this property. If he ever gave his mother access again, I could lock him out with a single swipe of my finger. He nodded silently, finally understanding the severity of the boundary I had just drawn in concrete. The technicians packed up their gear and drove away, leaving my house in absolute impenetrable silence. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, finally feeling a genuine sense of safety return to my bones. I took a deep breath, inhaling the rich scent of the coffee, ready to move forward with my day. Then my phone screen suddenly flashed bright red. It was not a normal notification. It was a high-priority fraud alert from the elite private wealth division of my bank. My heart rate spiked instantly. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure banking application. A message was flashing in bold letters across my dashboard. "Urgent fraud prevention alert. We have temporarily frozen an unauthorized wire transfer attempt originating from your joint checking account. A signature authorization form was submitted in person at our downtown branch 20 minutes ago, attempting to wire $50,000 to the Grace Fellowship Church Benevolence Fund." I stared at the screen, my blood turning to absolute ice. The Benevolence Fund was the private discretionary account Brenda managed as the head of the church hospitality committee. She used it like a personal piggy bank to fund her lavish outfits and social events. Brenda had failed to steal my house through her son. She had failed to intimidate me with her home invasion, so she had escalated to outright felony financial fraud. She actually believed she could forge my signature on a bank document and steal $50,000 of my hard-earned money to hand over to Greg. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. The ceramic clinked sharply against the stone. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. I felt the pure, thrilling adrenaline of a predator who had just watched its prey walk directly into a steel trap. Brenda had just handed me the rope to hang her with, and I was going to make sure the entire world watched her swing. I stared at the glowing red fraud alert on my phone screen. The audacity was almost impressive. Brenda had actually walked into my downtown bank branch, presented a forged authorization form with my forged signature, and attempted to wire $50,000 of my money directly into her church benevolence fund. She thought she could just bypass me entirely and hand the money over to Greg. I immediately tapped the call button on the alert. I was connected directly to my private wealth manager. He sounded nervous. He explained that a woman claiming to be acting on behalf of my husband had presented a physical document. But because my account required dual biometric authentication for any transfer over $10,000, the system automatically locked the funds and flagged the transaction. I told the manager to permanently ban Brenda from the branch and keep the forged document on file. I did not involve the police right then. I wanted to build a much larger cage. Less than 2 hours later, I was sitting at my mahogany desk at my firm when my office phone buzzed. It was my receptionist. Her voice was shaking. She told me that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were in the lobby and they were refusing to leave. Before I could even stand up, the heavy glass door to my suite swung open. Brenda and Tasha marched right past my horrified receptionist. Brenda was wearing one of her extravagant church hats and carrying a designer purse she absolutely could not afford. Tasha flanked her like a loyal bodyguard. "Where is the money, Jada?" Brenda demanded at the top of her lungs. Her voice carried easily through the glass walls of my office, drawing the attention of my entire staff. "You are illegally withholding funds that my son promised to his family." I calmly pressed a button under my desk. It activated the high-definition digital audio recorder I used for strictly documenting client meetings. I stood up and gestured for my receptionist to close the door and return to her desk. "Sit down, Brenda," I said evenly. "You are making a scene in my place of business." "I will not sit down," she yelled, stepping closer to my desk. "I went to the bank this morning to collect the $50,000 Andre agreed to lend Greg. The teller humiliated me. She told me the account was frozen and flagged for fraud. You did this, Jada. You are manipulating your husband and restricting his access to his own money. It is financial abuse, and I will not stand for it." Tasha crossed her arms and glared at me. "You are so selfish, Jada. Greg has investors waiting, and you are deliberately sabotaging his tech venture because you are jealous of his success. You need to call the bank right now and authorize that wire transfer." I looked at the two of them. They had worked themselves into a state of complete delusional hysteria. They honestly believed that if they screamed loud enough and caused enough embarrassment, I would simply hand over $50,000 to make them go away. "You forged my signature on a bank authorization form, Brenda," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. "That is a federal crime. The only reason you are standing in my office right now instead of a police precinct is because the bank security protocols caught your amateur attempt at fraud before the money moved." Brenda did not even flinch. She slammed her hands down on my desk. "Do not you dare accuse me of a crime. Andre told me to go to the bank. He told me the money was there. If you do not unfreeze that account right this second, I am going to the state accounting board." She leaned in closer, a vicious smile twisting her face. "I know how to ruin you, Jada. I will file a formal complaint with the licensing board. I will tell them you are committing financial abuse against your husband. I will tell them you are hiding assets and manipulating family funds. They will open a massive investigation into your little firm. I will destroy your professional reputation in this city. Hand over the $50,000 right now, or I will make sure you lose your license." Extortion. She was openly extorting me in my own office. I slowly sat back down in my leather executive chair. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single manila folder. I did not yell. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply opened the folder, extracted a single piece of paper, and slid it across the smooth wood of my desk. "I suggest you look very closely at that document before you threaten my career again, Brenda," I said softly. It was a formal notice of default. It was the original bank document from 2 years ago, clearly outlining that Brenda was completely bankrupt and her pristine suburban estate was slated for public auction. I had redacted the name of the private holding company that bought the debt, which was my company. I only wanted to show her that I had access to her deepest, darkest financial secrets. I was giving her one final chance to walk away. Brenda snatched the paper off the desk. She read the bold letters at the top. For a brief second, genuine panic flashed across her eyes. She recognized the document, but her narcissistic pride quickly swallowed her fear. She could not accept defeat, especially not in front of Tasha. She burst into loud theatrical laughter. She ripped the paper straight down the middle, then ripped it again, tossing the shredded pieces onto my desk. "You are pathetic, Jada," she sneered. "You actually dug up an ancient clerical error from years ago to try and scare me. That was a bank mistake, and it was resolved immediately. My house is fully paid off. I own my estate free and clear. You are nothing but a lying witch trying to deflect from your own stinginess." She adjusted her designer purse on her shoulder and looked down at me with absolute supreme arrogance. In fact, I am hosting the annual Women Guild Charity Gala at my home next Saturday night, she announced proudly. All the most important people in the church and the local government will be there. I expect you to be there to cater the food and serve the drinks. Maybe watching Real Wealth and Grace in action will teach you how a proper woman behaves. Come to your senses, Jada. You have until Friday to release that money to Greg, or I make the phone call to the licensing board. She turned around and strutted out of my office like she had just won a war. Tasha gave me one last disgusted look before following her mother out the glass door. I sat perfectly still until they were out of the building. The shredded pieces of the default notice rested on my desk like white confetti. I reached under the wood surface and pressed the button to stop the digital audio recorder. I saved the incredibly clear audio file of Brenda attempting to extort $50,000 and threatening to file a false report against my professional license. She had fully committed to her delusion. She actually believed her house was paid off. She actually believed she could host a massive high society charity gala without a single problem. What she did not realize was that I owned her house, and according to the legal reports I had received that very morning, the city had just quietly shut off her water and electricity due to massive unpaid utility bills. She was planning a massive party in a house with no running water, and a master deed held by the daughter-in-law she was currently trying to extort. The stage was perfectly set for her absolute destruction. It was the week of the highly anticipated Women Guild Charity Gala. I was scheduled to be in Chicago for a massive 3-day forensic accounting conference. My bags were packed and my flight was booked for Thursday morning. But something about the sheer arrogant confidence Brenda displayed in my office kept nagging at the back of my mind. She was a master manipulator, but she was not a magician. You cannot host a 100-person high society event in a house with no running water and no electricity. On Wednesday afternoon, while sitting in my office, I received a text message from a trusted neighbor who lived next door to my own house. The message contained a single photograph of a massive white event tent being erected in my pristine backyard, followed by a question asking if Andre and I were hosting a surprise neighborhood block party while I was supposed to be out of town. My blood ran completely cold. I immediately logged into my home security network on my computer. The military-grade biometric locks were still fully engaged. No one had used a fingerprint to enter through the doors. But when I checked the perimeter camera feed for the rear patio, my jaw clenched. Someone had taken a heavy brick and completely smashed the glass of the secondary utility window hidden behind the rose bushes. They had reached through, unlocked the interior latch, and bypassed the smart security system entirely to let the massive catering crew inside. Brenda was not hosting the charity gala at her pristine suburban estate. She had broken into my house, hijacked my property, and moved the entire 100-person event into my living room. I did not call the police right away. Having her arrested for breaking and entering was far too easy. It would allow her to play the ultimate victim, crying to the church congregation about a family misunderstanding. I wanted to dismantle her entirely, and I wanted to do it in front of the very audience she valued more than her own soul. I quietly canceled my flight to Chicago. I did not tell Andre. He was working late at his architectural firm across town and had no idea what his mother was currently orchestrating. I went home, packed a completely different overnight bag, and booked a luxury hotel suite downtown for the next 2 nights. I let Brenda spend 48 hours meticulously setting up her own public execution. Saturday night arrived. The evening air was crisp, and my quiet suburban street was lined with expensive luxury vehicles. I took an executive black car service from my hotel and instructed the driver to drop me off 2 blocks away from my own address. I walked the rest of the way, wearing a stunning tailored crimson evening gown that commanded absolute authority. When I turned the corner onto my street, the sheer scale of the audacity was breathtaking. There was a professional valet parking stand set up directly in my driveway. A smooth jazz band was playing on my back patio, the music drifting over the neighborhood. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black ties were carrying silver trays of expensive champagne through my front door. I confidently walked right past the confused valet attendant and stepped through my own doorway. The inside of my home had been completely transformed. The custom furniture was pushed back against the walls to create a massive open dance floor. Floral arrangements that must have cost thousands of dollars were scattered across my marble kitchen island. And there, standing right in the center of my living room beneath the crystal chandelier, was Brenda. She was wearing an extravagant silver sequined gown, dripping in fake diamonds, holding a delicate glass of champagne. She was surrounded by the local mayor, the head of the church guild, and several wealthy local politicians. I stood near the entryway and listened as her loud, proud voice carried easily over the jazz music. "Oh yes, we are just so incredibly blessed," Brenda laughed, waving her manicured hand around my beautiful home. "I actually bought this property a few years ago as a little real estate investment. I let my son and his wife live here rent-free so they can get on their feet. You know how the younger generation struggles these days. It is so rewarding to be able to provide this kind of luxury for them while still having a second home to host my lovely friends." I felt a cold, tight smile form on my lips. She was taking direct credit for my house, my furniture, my success, and my wealth. I looked toward the custom-built wet bar in the corner of the room. Greg was standing there in a cheap rented tuxedo pouring generous glasses of my incredibly rare $300 bourbon for his country club friends, acting as if he owned the entire liquor cabinet. I took a slow, deliberate step into the main room. The bright crimson of my gown caught the ambient light, and within seconds, people began to turn and stare. I did not belong to their exclusive church guild, but several of the prominent business owners in the room recognized me immediately as the forensic accountant who had saved their companies from bankruptcy. Brenda turned her head. When her eyes locked onto mine, the smug, triumphant smile vanished from her face so fast it was almost comical. She actually dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, splashing expensive wine onto the hem of her silver dress. She froze in absolute terror. She knew I was supposed to be halfway across the country in Chicago. She knew the biometric locks had kept her out of the front door. She knew exactly what she had done to get inside my home. "Excuse me for just one moment," she stammered to the mayor, her voice suddenly trembling. Brenda practically sprinted across the room toward me. She grabbed my arm with a desperate vice grip and dragged me forcefully into the dark hallway near the powder room, away from the prying eyes of her wealthy guests. Her chest was heaving. Her face was a terrifying mask of panic and pure vicious malice. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her fingernails digging painfully into my bare skin. "You are supposed to be in Chicago until Monday." "My flight was unexpectedly canceled," I replied smoothly, staring down at her hand until she slowly let go of my arm. Imagine my surprise when I came home to find a broken window and 100 trespassers drinking my expensive bourbon. "You listen to me, Jada," Brenda whispered frantically, her eyes darting back toward the living room to make sure no one was watching us. "The caterers are short-staffed and the food is getting cold. You are going to walk straight into that kitchen, put on a black apron, and start serving the crab cakes. You will not say a single word to anyone about who actually owns this house." "And why exactly would I do that?" I asked, calmly crossing my arms. "Because if you do not play along and serve my guests tonight, I will walk right back out there and announce to the entire congregation that your accounting firm is under active federal investigation for massive tax fraud. I will tell the mayor that you are a common criminal and that my son is divorcing you. I will completely ruin your reputation in this city before the night is over. You work for me tonight. Do you understand?" She was breathing heavily, desperate and completely unhinged. She actually thought she held the winning hand. She thought the threat of a massive public scandal would force me to submit, put on an apron, and serve her friends in my own house. I looked at her silver sequined dress. I looked at the sheer desperation burning in her eyes. I reached into my small, elegant evening clutch and pulled out my cell phone. "I understand perfectly, Brenda. I said softly. I turned my back on her, walked out of the dark hallway, and stepped directly into the center of the brightly lit living room. I bypassed the confused guests, ignored the horrified gasp from Tasha, who had just spotted me from the kitchen, and walked straight toward the jazz band. I reached down, unplugged the main amplifier cord for the instruments, and picked up the microphone. The smooth music cut out instantly with a loud, sharp screech. The entire room fell dead silent. 100 pairs of eyes turned to look at the woman in the crimson dress, holding the microphone in the middle of the dance floor. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "I would like to officially welcome you all to my home. Now let us have a real conversation about family legacy." The murmur of the crowd died instantly. 100 pairs of eyes shifted nervously between me and Brenda. I kept my gaze locked entirely on my mother-in-law as I lifted my phone and tapped the screen mirroring icon. Behind me, the massive 75-inch smart television mounted above my fireplace flared to life, casting a bright glow over the stunned audience. Brenda took a step backward, her face completely drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords seemed entirely paralyzed by fear. I did not give her the chance to recover. I pressed play on my phone. The crystal-clear audio from my office security system blasted through the surround sound speakers of my living room. Brenda's own vicious voice filled the space. "I know how to ruin you, Jada. I will file a formal complaint with the licensing board. I will tell them you are committing financial abuse against your husband. Hand over the $50,000 right now, or I will make sure you lose your license." A collective gasp echoed through the room. The head of the church hospitality committee, a woman who had known Brenda for 20 years, literally dropped her silk clutch onto the floor. The mayor, who had been chatting amicably with Brenda just 10 minutes prior, took 2 distinct steps away from her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. "That is a lie!" Brenda shrieked. Her voice cracked wildly. "That is a fabricated recording. She used a computer to fake my voice. She is a criminal." I smiled calmly and swiped my finger across my phone screen. The television display changed instantly. A massive high-resolution scan of a federal tax lien appeared, fully illuminating the room. "There is no need for fabrication when the public records tell the exact same story," I announced smoothly into the microphone. Since Brenda was so eager to discuss wealth tonight, I think her guests should know exactly who is pouring their drinks. The man standing behind my custom wet bar is Greg. He is the husband of Brenda's perfect daughter, Tasha. For months, Brenda has been demanding I take out a $250,000 loan against this very house to fund Greg's supposed tech venture. But as you can all clearly see on the screen, Greg is completely bankrupt. His trust fund is frozen, his last 3 businesses failed, and he currently owes the federal government over $80,000 in unpaid taxes. He has been surviving by entirely maxing out Brenda credit cards. Greg dropped the bottle of expensive bourbon he was holding. It shattered behind the bar, sending amber liquid splashing across the polished wood. Tasha buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her wealthy country club facade evaporated in front of her peers. "Please, Jada," Brenda begged, her arrogant mask entirely shattered. She was trembling, holding her hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Turn the screen off. I will leave. We will all leave right now. Just turn it off." "You do not get to walk away from the fire you intentionally started, Brenda," I said coldly. "You broke into my home. You hijacked my property because your own utilities were shut off due to massive unpaid debts, and you stood in my living room taking credit for my absolute hard work. So let us show everyone the grand finale. Let us talk about your pristine suburban estate." I swiped the screen one final time. The ultimate bomb dropped. It was the master deed to Brenda House. I used my fingers to zoom in heavily on the bottom paragraph, highlighting the section that clearly listed the sole lien holder. 2 years ago, Brenda was exactly 60 days away from complete public foreclosure, I explained to the completely silent room. Her house was going to be auctioned off on the courthouse steps. To save her from living on the street, I quietly purchased her debt through my private limited liability company. Look closely at the name on the screen. I am the sole lien holder. Brenda does not own that house. She has been paying rent to my company for 24 months to keep a roof over her head. The silence in the room was deafening. The illusion was completely dead. Brenda was not a wealthy matriarch. She was a broke, manipulative fraud, living entirely off the mercy of the daughter-in-law she had spent years actively trying to destroy. Brenda collapsed to her knees right in the middle of the dance floor. She covered her face, letting out a loud, pathetic wail. Nobody rushed to comfort her. Her friends simply stared at her in utter disgust. "You crazy witch!" Greg roared. The humiliation was too much for his fragile ego. He vaulted over the side of the wet bar, his face twisted in violent rage, charging straight toward me. I did not move. I did not flinch. Because before Greg could even take 3 steps across the hardwood floor, the heavy oak front door swung open. Andre walked in. He had just returned from his architectural firm. He was still wearing his suit jacket, holding his briefcase, standing frozen in the entryway. He took one look at the massive television displaying the deed, looked down at his mother sobbing on the floor, and then saw Greg charging at me. Andre dropped his briefcase. He moved faster than I had ever seen him move. He intercepted Greg halfway across the room, grabbing him by the collar of his rented tuxedo and shoving him violently backward. Greg crashed into the marble kitchen island, knocking a massive floral arrangement onto the floor. "Do not you ever take another step toward my wife," Andre bellowed. His voice shook the very foundation of the house. Greg scrambled to his feet, holding his bruised shoulder, looking absolutely terrified of the rage radiating from Andre. Tasha ran over to her husband, pulling him toward the back door, desperate to escape the nightmare. Andre turned his back on them and looked down at his mother. Brenda reached her hand up toward him, her face streaked with mascara tears. "Andre, please," she whimpered. "She humiliated me. She humiliated your family." "You are not my family anymore," Andre said. His voice was no longer shouting. It was cold, final, and completely devoid of any remaining affection. "You broke into our home. You tried to steal my wife money. You lied to me for years. We are done. Do not ever call my phone again." The mayor cleared his throat uncomfortably. He set his half-empty champagne glass down on a nearby side table. "I think it is time for us to leave," he announced quietly to the rest of the guests. Within 5 minutes, the mass exodus began. The wealthy socialites, the church leaders, and the local politicians filed silently out the front door, avoiding eye contact with Brenda, who was still sitting on the floor. Nobody thanked her for the evening. Nobody offered her a ride. They simply walked out, whispering furiously among themselves, permanently cementing her social destruction. When the house was finally empty, save for the hired catering crew frantically packing up their equipment in the kitchen, Andre walked over to me. He gently took the microphone from my hand and set it down. He pulled me into a tight embrace, burying his face in my neck. "I am so sorry I let it get this far, Jada," he whispered. "You were right. You were right about all of it." I wrapped my arms around his shoulders, finally letting out a long, exhausted breath. I knew the war was officially over. 2 weeks later, I legally executed the foreclosure on Brenda Estate. She had blatantly violated the morality and harassment clauses I had secretly built into our original bailout contract. I gave her 30 days to vacate the premises. With no money and her reputation completely annihilated, she was forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment downtown with Tasha and Greg. From what I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, the 3 of them immediately began tearing each other apart, suffocating under the weight of their combined debts and massive egos. I never spoke to her again. I sold her suburban estate for a massive profit and used the funds to open a second branch of my forensic accounting firm. Andre finally went to therapy, unpacked decades of generational trauma, and started his own independent architectural design company. I sit here now on my back patio, sipping a glass of expensive bourbon, listening to the quiet hum of my biometric locks securing the perimeter. Protecting my peace required going to absolute war, but standing up for my own worth was the greatest investment I ever made. True family is built on mutual respect, not toxic entitlement. And sometimes, taking out the trash is the only way to finally breathe clean air. I stood in the center of my hijacked living room, the heavy silence broken only by the sound of Andre nervously shifting his weight. He looked completely paralyzed, his eyes darting between my furious expression and the hideous oversized canvas portrait of his sister Tasha hanging on my wall. He knew he had crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. "Jada, please let me explain," Andre stammered, raising his hands in a weak gesture of surrender. "She showed up yesterday completely hysterical. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She told me her chest was hurting and she felt like the family was falling apart after that dinner." I stared at him, my face a carefully constructed mask of absolute calm. "You let her break into our home because she threw a tantrum," I said, my voice dangerously low. "She did not break in," Andre pleaded, his voice cracking with guilt. "She remembered where the emergency lockbox was hidden under the patio stones. She let herself in while I was at work. When I got home, she was already here. She said she just wanted to make the house feel more welcoming so we could host a reconciliation dinner for Tasha and Greg. She said your grandmother quilt was fraying, and it did not fit the modern aesthetic. I was just so exhausted, Jada. I did not have the energy to fight another one of her screaming matches. I thought if I just let her leave a few pictures, it would buy us some peace." "There is no peace when you negotiate with a terrorist," I replied coldly. "Where is my quilt, Andre?" He swallowed hard, looking toward the kitchen door. "She put it in the heavy-duty garbage bin in the garage." I did not scream. I did not throw a fit. I simply turned my back on my husband, walked straight through the kitchen, and pushed open the heavy fire door leading to the garage. The air out there was hot and stagnant. I marched over to the massive plastic trash bin and ripped the lid off. My heart pounded against my ribs as I dug through discarded cardboard boxes and empty plastic bottles. And then I saw it. The deep red and gold patchwork fabric of my late grandmother quilt. It was shoved into the bottom of the bin like common refuse. My hands actually shook with pure rage as I carefully pulled the quilt out. I brushed off the dust and inspected the delicate hand stitching. By some absolute miracle, the fabric was not torn or stained. I held it tightly against my chest, inhaling the faint familiar scent of cedar that still lingered in the old fabric. I carried it back inside, completely ignoring Andre, who was standing helplessly by the kitchen island. I gently placed the quilt on top of the marble counter, safe from the destruction I was about to unleash. Then I walked into the utility closet and pulled out a fresh box of heavy-duty black contractor trash bags. Andre watched me with wide, fearful eyes as I snapped the first thick plastic bag open. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet house. "What are you doing?" he asked nervously, taking a step back. "I am taking out the trash," I said without looking at him. I marched directly into the living room. I walked straight up to the massive canvas portrait of Greg and Tasha smiling on a sailboat. I grabbed the wooden frame with both hands and ripped it off the wall with so much force that the metal hook tore a chunk of drywall out with it. I did not care. Drywall can be repaired. Disrespect cannot be tolerated. I shoved the giant picture into the black trash bag, hearing the wood frame snap under the pressure. I moved through my house like a hurricane. I grabbed the cheap fake fur throw blankets Brenda had draped over my imported leather sofa and shoved them into the bag. I marched into the guest bathroom and swept her tacky lavender potpourri jars directly into the trash, letting the glass shatter against the plastic. I found 4 more framed photographs of Greg hidden on the bookshelves in the hallway. Into the bag they went. I found a set of hideous floral curtains she had tried to hang in the dining room. I ripped them down, rod and all. "Jada, please," Andre whispered, following me down the hallway. "She is going to notice everything is gone. She is going to lose her mind." "Let her lose it," I snapped, turning to face him. I am the sole provider for this household. I pay the mortgage. I pay the property taxes. I paid for the furniture she just tried to replace. This is my sanctuary. And if you ever allow that woman to compromise my sanctuary again, you will be the next thing I pack into a contractor bag. Do you understand me? Andre froze. The absolute certainty in my voice completely shattered whatever lingering defense he had for his mother. He looked down at the floor and slowly nodded his head. He finally understood that I was not playing a game. I finished purging the house in less than 20 minutes. I dragged 4 bulging black trash bags out the front door, the heavy plastic scraping against the concrete driveway. I popped the trunk of my luxury SUV and violently shoved the bags inside. I slammed the trunk shut, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I drove straight out of my upscale neighborhood and headed toward the nearest charity donation center. It was a small Goodwill store situated in a busy shopping plaza. I pulled up to the donation drop-off lane, stepped out of my car, and unloaded all 4 bags directly onto the receiving cart. I did not ask for a tax receipt. I just wanted the physical manifestation of Brenda delusion completely eradicated from my life. Let some stranger buy her cheap aesthetics for a few dollars. Her vision of a perfect family had absolutely no place in my reality. The drive back home was silent and cleansing. The suffocating anger in my chest slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Brenda had escalated her attacks from verbal insults to a physical invasion of my property. She thought she could mark her territory while I was out of town building my wealth. She thought my husband was weak enough to let her get away with it. But she had grossly underestimated me. I parked my SUV in the garage and walked back into my house. The hideous lavender smell was already fading. Andre was sitting quietly on the edge of our bed, staring blankly at the wall. I did not comfort him. He needed to sit in the discomfort of his own failure. I walked past the bedroom, pulled my cell phone from my pocket, and dialed the emergency contact number for the elite private security firm that managed my corporate accounting office. Standard locks were no longer going to cut it. It was time to turn my home into an absolute fortress. The elite private security team arrived at my property before the sun was even fully up the next morning. 3 technicians dressed in crisp black uniforms backed a heavy cargo van into my driveway and began unloading reinforced metal cases. Andre stood by the kitchen island holding his coffee mug. He watched in complete silence as the lead technician began aggressively dismantling the old brass deadbolts on our front door. I had not hired a standard residential locksmith. I had contracted the same high-level security firm that protected the corporate servers at my forensic accounting agency. The hardware they were installing was not the kind of smart lock you could buy at a local hardware store. These were military-grade biometric scanners. There were no physical keyholes to pick. There were no digital keypads where a passcode could be memorized or texted to an unauthorized family member. The system relied entirely on a direct scan of living tissue. I stood in the foyer, my arms crossed, watching the heavy, sleek metal casing being bolted directly into the reinforced door frame. The only way through my front door, my garage entrance, or the heavy oak door leading to my private home office would be through my specific biological data. When the physical installation was complete, the lead technician walked me through the master control application on my phone. He showed me how the system would instantly flag an unrecognized fingerprint, log the time of the attempt, and if tampered with, send a silent alarm directly to the local police department. I registered my right thumb and my index finger, listening to the satisfying electronic chime that confirmed my absolute authority over the perimeter. Then I called Andre over. He set his coffee mug down and walked slowly into the foyer. He hesitated before pressing his thumb against the glowing blue sensor. I held up my phone screen so he could clearly see the digital dashboard. I made sure he watched exactly what I was typing, as I assigned his fingerprint to a standard restricted user profile. I looked him dead in the eye. My voice was calm but completely devoid of warmth. I need you to understand exactly what this means, Andre. I am the sole administrator of this security network. You have access to come and go, but you cannot add new users. You cannot bypass the system. If I ever suspect for a single second that you have allowed your mother onto this property again, I can revoke your access with a single swipe of my finger. You will be locked out on the street alongside her." Andre swallowed hard. He looked at the heavy metal scanner and then back at me. He nodded slowly. The reality of his catastrophic failure had finally cemented itself in his mind. He knew I was not making an idle threat. I was drawing a line in concrete, and if he stepped over it, our marriage was entirely over. By noon, the security technicians had packed up their tools and driven away. The house was blissfully silent. I walked through the downstairs floor plan, pulling on the handles of the heavy exterior doors. They did not budge. They felt like vault doors. For the first time since returning from my business trip to Atlanta, the suffocating anxiety finally left my chest. My sanctuary was a fortress once again. I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water and sat down at the kitchen island. I opened my laptop, mentally preparing to dive back into my corporate case files. I assumed that Brenda had been effectively neutralized. I figured the sheer embarrassment of discovering her cheap decorations had been thrown into a dumpster would keep her away from me for at least a few months. I was completely wrong. Narcissists do not feel embarrassment. They only feel a raging sense of entitlement. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, my cell phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop. The screen did not light up with a standard text message or a polite calendar reminder. The entire screen flashed a blinding solid red. It was the emergency override alert from the private wealth management division of my bank. My heart rate spiked instantly, but my forensic accounting instincts immediately took over. Panic is for amateurs. Data is for professionals. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and opened the secure banking application. A massive warning banner completely covered my digital financial dashboard. It read, "Urgent Fraud Prevention Alert." The detailed text below it outlined exactly what had triggered the system. 20 minutes ago, someone had walked into my primary downtown bank branch and attempted to authorize an in-person wire transfer originating from my joint checking account. The requested amount was $50,000. I stared at the numbers on the screen. The teller had processed a physical wire authorization form containing my signature. But because my account held substantial corporate assets, I had instituted a strict security protocol years ago. Any outgoing transfer over $10,000 required an immediate secondary biometric authentication through my personal mobile device. The system had automatically frozen the funds and flagged the entire transaction for high-level review. I scrolled down to look at the destination account for the wire transfer. The money was not being sent to Greg. It was not being sent directly to Tasha. The routing number belonged to the Grace Fellowship Church Benevolence Fund. A cold, dark laugh escaped my lips. The Benevolence Fund was the discretionary charity account that Brenda managed as the absolute head of her church hospitality committee. She treated that fund like her own personal slush account. She used it to host lavish luncheons, buy extravagant church hats, and maintain her illusion of high society status while claiming the money was for community outreach. The sheer audacity of her master plan settled over me. Brenda had failed to manipulate her son into signing a massive commercial loan against my house. She had failed to intimidate me by breaking in and redecorating my living room. So she had escalated her tactics to the highest possible level. She had literally forged my signature on a federal banking document. She actually believed she could walk into a financial institution, pretend she was acting on my behalf, and steal $50,000 of my hard-earned money to quietly hand over to her bankrupt son-in-law. She thought routing it through the church would mask the trail and make it look like a charitable donation if anyone ever checked the statements. She did not realize she was trying to steal from a woman who tracked missing millions for a living. I immediately tapped the emergency call button on the alert screen. I was connected directly to my dedicated private wealth manager. He sounded incredibly nervous. He explained that an older woman wearing a large designer hat had presented the physical document to a junior teller. When the system locked the account and the teller asked for secondary identification, the woman became highly combative, snatched her purse, and rushed out of the branch. I need you to scan that forged document and email it to my secure server immediately, I told the manager. My voice was perfectly steady. Do not delete the security footage of her at the teller window. Keep the account frozen and flag the entire interaction as a confirmed case of identity theft and attempted federal wire fraud. Should I contact the local authorities right now to file a police report? The manager asked. I looked out the window of my heavily secured home. Having Brenda quietly arrested for fraud in a sterile police station was far too easy. It would allow her to play the victim, crying to her church congregation about a terrible misunderstanding and an unforgiving daughter-in-law. I wanted to dismantle her entirely, and I wanted to do it on my own terms. No, I replied smoothly. Secure the evidence. I will handle the authorities myself when the time is right. I ended the call and set the phone down. I did not feel fear. I felt the pure, thrilling adrenaline of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a trap. Brenda had just crossed the point of no return. She had handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy her completely. I knew Brenda would not simply accept defeat and hide in shame. Narcissists do not retreat when they are caught in a lie. They double down. They twist the narrative and go on the offensive to make themselves the victim. I spent the rest of my afternoon printing out the high-resolution scan of the forged bank transfer document my wealth manager had emailed me. I placed it inside a crisp manila folder on my desk, alongside the printed security camera footage showing Brenda standing at the teller window in her ridiculous, oversized church hat. I locked the folder in my top drawer and went home to a peaceful, heavily secured house. Andre tried to ask me about my day, but I simply told him I was handling a complex corporate fraud case. It was not a lie. The next morning, the storm finally hit exactly where I expected it to. My forensic accounting firm occupied the entire top floor of a premium downtown high-rise. We handled multi-million-dollar asset recoveries and federal tax audits. The atmosphere in my office was always one of absolute quiet professionalism. The floors were polished marble, the walls were thick tempered glass, and my staff of 20 highly trained accountants worked in focused silence. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, that professional silence was violently shattered. I was sitting at my mahogany desk reviewing a client portfolio when I heard the unmistakable shrill voice of my mother-in-law echoing down the main corridor. My office phone buzzed frantically. It was my front desk receptionist, a sharp young woman named Chloe. "Miss Jada," Chloe said, her voice tight with panic. "There are two women in the lobby. They bypassed the security desk downstairs by claiming they had a family emergency. They are refusing to sit down and they are yelling at the staff." I closed my client portfolio and took a slow, steady breath. "I will handle it, Chloe," I replied smoothly. "Do not call building security just yet." I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored navy blue suit, and walked out of my private office. The moment I stepped into the main corridor, the sheer volume of the chaos hit me. Brenda was standing right in the center of our elegant reception area, waving her arms wildly. She was wearing a bright yellow floral dress and carrying a fake designer handbag that she was practically swinging like a weapon. Tasha stood right beside her, arms crossed, looking at my terrified receptionist with pure disgust. Several of my senior accountants had stepped out of their offices to see what the commotion was. A prominent corporate client who was waiting for a meeting looked absolutely horrified. Brenda had successfully created a public spectacle, and she was basking in the attention. "Where is she?" Brenda screamed at Chloe, slamming her hand down on the reception desk. "Go get Jada right now. I know she is hiding in there. She is a thief, and I want everyone in this building to know exactly what kind of woman is running this business." I walked down the corridor, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I did not rush. I did not look embarrassed. I carried myself with the absolute authority of a woman who owned the entire floor. "I am right here, Brenda," I said. My voice was calm and even, cutting effortlessly through her hysterical screaming. "There is no need to harass my staff." Brenda spun around to face me, Her eyes were wild with artificial outrage. She marched toward me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Tasha followed close behind her like a loyal attack dog. "There you are," Brenda yelled so loudly that her voice echoed off the glass walls. "You are illegally withholding family funds, Jada. I went to the bank yesterday to collect the $50,000 that my son promised to his family for Greg and his new business venture. But the teller humiliated me. She told me the account was completely frozen. You locked up your husband money. You are committing financial abuse and restricting his access to his own accounts." Tasha stepped forward, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. "You are so incredibly selfish, Jada. Greg has serious investors waiting for that capital. You are deliberately sabotaging his tech venture because you are jealous of his success. You think because you sit in this fancy office, you can just dictate how our family money is spent. Andre promised us that $50,000 and you need to call the bank right now and authorize that wire transfer." I looked at the two of them. They had worked themselves into a state of complete delusional hysteria. They honestly believed that if they screamed loud enough and caused enough embarrassment in front of my employees and clients, I would simply cave to the pressure. They thought my professional reputation was my weak point. They assumed I would hand over $50,000 just to make them go away and avoid a public scandal. I glanced around the lobby. My staff was watching in stunned silence. This was the exact environment I needed to assert absolute dominance. I did not whisper. I did not try to pull them into a private corner. I wanted everyone to hear my response. "Andre did not promise you $50,000, Tasha," I said clearly, projecting my voice so it carried across the entire reception area. "Because Andre does not have $50,000 to give you. He is a junior architect whose entire salary goes toward paying his own student loans. Every single penny in that joint banking account was earned by my firm." Brenda gasped loudly, placing her hand over her chest in mock horror. "How dare you emasculate my son in public? A wife submits to her husband. His money is family money, and you are holding it hostage." "You did not try to withdraw family money, Brenda," I corrected her. My tone remained surgical and cold. "You walked into a federal financial institution, presented a fraudulent wire authorization form with my forged signature on the bottom line, and attempted to transfer my personal assets directly into your church benevolence fund so you could secretly hand it over to Greg." Tasha's eyes widened in genuine shock. She looked quickly at her mother. Brenda had clearly not told her daughter about the forgery part of the plan. She had only told Tasha that I was blocking the transaction. "That is a vicious lie," Brenda shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. She pointed her finger at my staff. "Do you all hear how she lies? She is trying to cover up her financial abuse by accusing a woman of the church of a crime." "I am not accusing you of anything, Brenda," I replied smoothly. "I am simply stating the facts as documented by the bank security cameras and the physical evidence currently locked in my desk drawer. You forged my signature to steal $50,000. The only reason you are standing in my lobby right now instead of sitting in a police precinct holding cell is because my corporate security protocols caught your amateur attempt at fraud before the money ever left my account." Brenda's chest was heaving. Her narcissistic pride simply could not accept defeat, especially not when she had an audience. She refused to back down. She closed the distance between us until she was standing just inches away from me. "You think you are so smart with your little numbers and your security rules?" she hissed softly, dropping her voice so only I could hear the pure venom. "But I know how to ruin you, Jada. I will file a formal complaint with the state accounting board. I will tell them you are committing severe financial abuse against your husband. I will tell them you are hiding assets and manipulating family funds to starve his relatives. They will open a massive investigation into your firm. I will destroy your professional reputation in this city forever. Hand over the $50,000 right now, or I make the phone call today." She was openly extorting me in my own place of business. It was the absolute pinnacle of her arrogance. I did not flinch. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply smiled. "Step into my office, Brenda," I said softly. "Let us see if you still want to make that phone call after I show you exactly what happens when you threaten my livelihood." Brenda stomped past me, her fake designer bag hitting the heavy doorframe. Tasha trailed right behind her, her chin held high as if she were walking into a royal court instead of my private office. I stepped inside and pulled the thick glass door shut until I heard the heavy latch click into place. The advanced soundproofing of my suite instantly completely muted the nervous murmurs of my staff out in the lobby. We were entirely sealed off from the rest of the floor. I walked around my massive mahogany desk and sat down in my leather executive chair. I did not offer them a seat. I casually reached under the thick wooden lip of my desk and pressed the small tactile button that activated my high-definition digital audio recorder. A tiny red light blinked once against my leg, confirming the device was actively rolling. Brenda marched right up to the edge of my desk and slapped both of her hands flat against the polished wood. "Do not think you can intimidate me by bringing me back here, Jada," she spat, her eyes wide with frantic energy. "You are going to log into your computer right now and authorize that wire transfer. You are going to release that $50,000 to my church benevolence fund today." "And if I refuse?" I asked softly, keeping my face a perfectly blank mask. Brenda stood up straight and crossed her arms, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She felt emboldened by the privacy of the room. She thought she had me cornered. "If you do not wire the money immediately, I will walk straight to the State Accounting and Licensing Board," Brenda threatened. Her voice was dripping with absolute malice. "I know important people, Jada. I have influential friends in the church who play golf with city commissioners. I will file a formal grievance against your professional license. I will tell them you are using your forensic accounting skills to illegally hide marital assets from my son." Tasha stepped up beside her mother, nodding vigorously. "And we will tell them you are financially abusing Andre," Tasha added. "We will say you control his every move, that you lock him out of his own bank accounts, and that you manipulate his finances to starve his family." The board takes financial abuse very seriously, especially when it involves a licensed accountant embezzling from her own husband. I stared at them in complete silence. The sheer legal ignorance they were displaying was staggering, but I needed them to explicitly state their demands for the audio recording. I needed the criminal intent to be completely undeniable. "You are demanding that I give you $50,000 to keep you from reporting a fabricated crime to my licensing board," I clarified. My voice was perfectly steady, enunciating every single word so the microphone under my desk would pick it up perfectly. "That is the textbook definition of extortion, Brenda. That is a felony. Call it whatever you want to call it," Brenda scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "I call it securing my family legacy. Greg needs that startup capital for his tech venture. He has office leases to sign downtown and patents to file this week. He is going to be a millionaire in 6 months, and we will never let Andre forget how his own wife tried to hold us back out of pure jealousy. Greg is a bankrupt, unemployed man living off your credit cards," I stated simply. "Do not you dare disrespect my husband," Tasha shrieked, slamming her hand on my desk right where her mother had just slapped it. "Greg understands high-level networking. You just crunch numbers in a cubicle. You think because you sit in this fancy corner office you are untouchable. But nobody is completely clean, Jada. Greg said that if the board opens a massive investigation into your firm, they will definitely find something wrong with your client books. Why risk a massive federal audit over 50 grand? Just pay the money and we will walk away." I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and folded my hands elegantly in my lap. I was letting them talk. Every single word they spoke was another heavy iron nail in their own coffins. Brenda walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling city skyline before turning back to face me. She wanted to deliver her final blow. She wanted to see me break. "You have built quite a little empire for yourself here, haven't you?" Brenda said smoothly, her eyes scanning the expensive artwork on my walls. "A girl from your background, climbing all the way up to the top floor. It would be an absolute tragedy to watch it all crumble to dust, Because you were too greedy to share your blessings with your real family. A good wife would support her husband. But you provide no warmth. You provide no children. All you care about is this sterile office and hoarding your wealth. I did not blink. I did not let her venomous insults about my marriage or my fertility breach my armor. Emotion is exactly what an extortionist feeds on, and I was going to starve her out. You have until Friday, Jada, Brenda announced, her tone shifting from mocking to completely ruthless. Friday by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. If that $50,000 is not sitting in my church benevolence fund by the close of business, I make the phone call. Your spotless career will be over. You will lose your license, your wealthy corporate clients will abandon you, and my son will divorce you for ruining his family name. She stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for me to panic. She was waiting for me to pull out my checkbook or turn around and log into my banking portal. She expected me to beg for mercy or try to negotiate a lower amount. She thought she held the absolute ultimate leverage over my life. I looked at her yellow floral dress. I looked at the sheer, desperate greed burning in Tasha's eyes. They had walked into a fortress completely unarmed, demanding the king hand over the crown. It was time to show them exactly what happened when you tried to blackmail a woman who held the master deed to your entire existence. I did not reach for my checkbook. I did not pick up the phone to beg my bank to release the frozen funds. I simply looked at the digital clock sitting on my desk. It was 10:30 in the morning. I had an entire empire to run, a staff to manage, and corporate clients who paid me thousands of dollars an hour to secure their assets. I was entirely done playing games with a woman who did not even own the roof over her head. I kept my eyes locked on Brenda as I reached down and unlocked the heavy bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. The metal mechanism clicked sharply in the quiet room. I pulled out a single unmarked manila folder and placed it deliberately in the center of the polished wood. I rested my hand flat on top of it. "You think you hold all the cards, Brenda?" I said. My voice was no longer conversational. It was a soft, dangerous whisper that commanded absolute attention. "You think because you wear expensive church hats and host lavish Sunday dinners that nobody can see through the cracks in your foundation. But I am a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on finding the dark, dirty secrets that arrogant people try to hide." I opened the folder. Inside was the document I had prepared earlier that afternoon. It was not the forged wire transfer authorization. I was saving that felony for a much larger stage. This was something older and much more devastating to her fragile ego. It was the formal notice of default issued by a major national bank exactly 2 years ago. I had taken a thick black permanent marker and completely redacted the name of the private limited liability company that had swooped in and purchased the debt at the very last second. I wanted to give her a breadcrumb, a terrifying glimpse into the abyss, without revealing that I was the one holding the flashlight. I slid the single piece of paper across the smooth desk. It stopped right at the edge, brushing against Brenda manicured fingertips. Brenda looked down. For a split second she refused to read it. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw. Her eyes scanned the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Below that legal heading was her full legal name, the name of her late husband, and the exact address of her pristine suburban estate. "Read it carefully, Brenda," I instructed calmly, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. "That is an official bank record from 24 months ago. It clearly outlines that you were exactly 60 days away from complete financial ruin. You had completely defaulted on your mortgage. You had exhausted all of your extensions. The bank was preparing to literally lock your doors, throw your belongings onto the lawn, and auction your precious estate on the county courthouse steps." Tasha leaned over her mother's shoulder. Her face contorted in absolute confusion. She squinted at the paper, reading the massive numbers listed under the total amount due. "Mom, what is this?" Tasha asked, her voice trembling with sudden uncertainty. "You told us the house was fully paid off. You told us Dad left you the house free and clear when he passed away. You said you owned it outright. Shut up, Tasha, Brenda snapped, her voice cracking wildly for the very first time. She snatched the paper off the desk and held it up to the light as if looking for a flaw. Her hands were visibly shaking. This is fake. This is a fabricated document. You printed this off the internet to try and scare me. You are just trying to deflect from the fact that you are stealing from my son. It has the official watermarks of your lending institution, Brenda, I replied smoothly. You know exactly what it is because you sat in a bank manager office crying and begging for more time. And you also know that by some absolute miracle, a private buyer stepped in at the very last minute, paid off your massive arrears in full, and took over the master deed. You have been paying rent to a faceless holding company for 2 years just to keep up appearances and avoid living on the street. Brenda stared at the thick black marker redacting the name of the holding company. She had absolutely no idea who actually owned her house. The bank had handled the transaction through a blind trust. She only knew she sent a massive check to a post office box every single month. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a new terrifying realization. She realized I had access to the one secret she had guarded with her life. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. You walked into my office to threaten my livelihood over $50,000, but you are standing on a trapdoor, Brenda. I am holding the lever. If you ever mention my professional license again, if you ever take another step toward my bank, or if you even think about calling the state accounting board on Friday, I will not just report your little wire fraud attempt to the police. I paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the room to ensure my next words hit with maximum impact. I will take the fully unredacted version of that default notice, and I will personally hand-deliver a copy to the mayor. I continued coldly. I will mail a copy to the head of your church guild. I will email a high-resolution PDF to every single member of your prestigious hospitality committee. They will all know that you are a completely broke fraud living in a house you do not even own. Your social standing will evaporate overnight. You will be the laughingstock of this entire city. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The threat of losing her social status was far more terrifying to her than the threat of jail time. It was the absolute core of her narcissistic identity. I am giving you one single chance to walk out of this glass door with whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left, I said, pointing toward the exit. Do not dig a grave you absolutely cannot climb out of. Take your daughter, take your fake designer bag, and get out of my office before I decide to ruin your life today. Brenda stood frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the dam broke. She threw her head back and let out a loud, piercing laugh. It was not a laugh of genuine amusement. It was the hysterical, frantic sound of a narcissist whose reality was actively crumbling and who desperately needed to glue it back together with pure volume. She reached out and snatched the redacted notice of default right off my mahogany desk. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the thick paper. You really think you can play these little mind games with me, Jada? Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She gripped the top of the paper and violently ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp, tearing sound echoed loudly in the soundproof office. She put the 2 halves together and tore them again, reducing the official bank document to jagged pieces of trash. She threw the shredded paper directly into the air. The pieces fluttered down like cheap confetti, landing across my keyboard and my polished wooden desk. My house is fully paid off, you lying witch, Brenda shouted, leaning over the desk so her face was only inches from mine. I own my estate free and clear. That stupid piece of paper is nothing but an ancient banking error from years ago. It was resolved immediately. My late husband left me a fortune, and you are just a bitter, jealous girl trying to forge documents to hide the fact that you are stealing my son money. Tasha nodded aggressively, stepping up right beside her mother. You are pathetic, Jada. You actually thought you could print out a fake piece of paper and scare us into walking away from our own family wealth. Greg was right about you. You are completely unhinged. I did not blink. I did not brush the torn pieces of paper off my desk. I sat perfectly still, letting their delusional arrogance fill the room. They were so deeply entrenched in their own lies that they had genuinely convinced themselves the truth was a fabrication. Brenda straightened her posture, adjusting her bright yellow floral dress and pulling her fake designer handbag higher up on her shoulder. She looked down her nose at me, her face contorting into an expression of absolute supreme superiority. She had convinced herself she had just won the battle. Now she wanted to humiliate the prisoner. In fact, Brenda announced proudly, her voice echoing with artificial grandeur, I am hosting the annual Women Guild Charity Gala at my home next Saturday night. It is going to be the social event of the entire season. The mayor will be there. The city commissioners will be there. Every single important member of the church leadership will be standing in my grand foyer admiring my beautiful estate. She leaned in closer, a vicious smile twisting her lips. I expect you to be there, Jada, but you will not be attending as a guest. You do not have the class or the pedigree to mingle with my friends. I expect you to arrive early, put on a black uniform apron, and cater the event. You can serve the champagne and pass out the crab cakes. Maybe watching real wealth and grace in action will finally teach you how a proper woman is supposed to behave. She gave me one final look of absolute disgust. Come to your senses, Jada. You have until Friday afternoon to release that $50,000 to Greg. If you do not, I make the phone call to the state board, and I end your career. Be at my house on Saturday, with a serving tray in your hand. Brenda turned on her heel and strutted toward the heavy glass door of my office. She walked with the exaggerated confidence of a queen who had just conquered a rebellious province. Tasha gave me one last pathetic smirk before turning to follow her mother. Neither of them looked back as they pulled the heavy door open and marched out into the main corridor. I watched through the glass walls as Brenda paraded past my reception desk, her head held high, completely ignoring the confused stares of my professional staff. They stepped into the elevator, the metal doors sliding shut, finally removing their toxic presence from my floor. The second they were out of sight, the cold, calculated mask I had been wearing melted into a slow, genuine smile. I looked down at the shredded pieces of the redacted default notice scattered across my desk. I reached under the thick wooden lip of the desk and pressed the small, tactile button. The tiny red light stopped blinking. The digital audio recorder powered down, instantly saving the high-definition file to its internal memory. I reached into my drawer, pulled the small black device out, and immediately connected it to my secure computer terminal. Within seconds, I had uploaded the crystal-clear audio file to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. I put on my wireless headphones and played the last 10 minutes back to myself. The audio was absolutely flawless. Every single word was perfectly captured. I had Brenda on tape openly demanding $50,000 under the explicit threat of filing a false report to my professional licensing board to destroy my career. I had Tasha on tape agreeing to the extortion. They had just handed me a silver platter containing a multi-count felony indictment. But calling the police right now was still too easy. A quiet arrest would not satisfy the debt they owed me for disrespecting my marriage and invading my home. I wanted a public execution. I took off my headphones and leaned back in my chair, staring out the massive window at the city skyline. Brenda had just gleefully announced that she was hosting the most prestigious social event of the year at her pristine suburban estate next Saturday night. She had invited the mayor, the city commissioners, and the entire church hierarchy. She wanted to stand in the center of her grand living room and pretend she was a wealthy matriarch. She wanted to force me to wear an apron and serve her friends. But Brenda was missing one massive, catastrophic piece of information. Because I was the sole owner of the private limited liability company that held the deed to her house, all official municipal notices regarding the property were legally copied to my corporate mailing address. Just 2 days ago, I had received a certified letter from the city utility department. Brenda had not paid her water or electric bills in over 6 months. She had ignored every single final warning notice. According to the document sitting in my locked filing cabinet, the city was scheduled to permanently shut off all power and running water to her estate by this coming Wednesday. Brenda was planning a lavish 100-person high society gala in a house that would be completely pitch black and devoid of a single drop of running water. She was walking completely blind into an absolute massacre of her own making, and I was going to make sure I had a front row seat to watch it happen. Wednesday arrived with a heavy gray overcast that perfectly matched my cold and calculated mood. I did not call Brenda. I did not send her a warning text. I simply went to my downtown office, sat at my massive mahogany desk, and opened my laptop. Using my corporate credentials, I logged directly into the Municipal Utility Management portal. Because my private holding company was listed as the primary legal owner of Brenda Pristine's suburban estate, I had full administrative access to all municipal services connected to that property. I watched the digital dashboard with a quiet, thrilling sense of anticipation. At exactly 10 in the morning, the status indicator for her address shifted from a flashing yellow warning to a solid dark red. The municipal grid had officially severed her connection. Her water main was remotely locked by the city, and her electrical meter was completely deactivated. Her sprawling, beautiful house was now nothing more than an expensive dark cave. I pictured Brenda waking up, trying to turn on her extravagant crystal chandeliers, trying to run the water for her morning coffee, and slowly realizing the absolute gravity of her situation. I fully expected my phone to ring. I expected a frantic, hysterical phone call from her demanding that I fix the problem. I expected her to finally break down, admit defeat, and beg for my help. But my phone remained completely silent for the rest of the day. Thursday morning, I packed my professional luggage for my highly anticipated 3-day forensic accounting conference in Chicago. Andre drove me to the airport in complete silence. He looked absolutely exhausted. He had not spoken a single word to his mother since the terrifying incident where I threw her cheap decorations into the trash bags. As he pulled up to the departure curb, he finally looked over at me. He nervously asked if I thought Brenda would actually follow through on her vicious threat to call the state accounting board on Friday afternoon. I looked him dead in the eye and told him not to worry about my career. I told him I had secured our assets and that his mother had entirely run out of ammunition. I kissed his cheek, grabbed my suitcase, and walked into the airport terminal without looking back. I settled into my first-class seat, ordered a glass of sparkling water, and assumed the war was officially on pause. I figured Brenda would spend the entire weekend frantically making up wild excuses to her prestigious church guild. I assumed she would tell them a major pipe had burst or a neighborhood power transformer had blown, forcing her to temporarily cancel her grand charity gala. I underestimated the sheer terrifying depth of her narcissistic delusion. The conference in Chicago was incredibly demanding. I gave the driver my home address and promised him a substantial cash tip if he made the trip in record time. The drive through my city was a blur of neon lights and evening traffic. Usually, the transition from the bustling downtown highway to my quiet upscale suburban neighborhood brought me a deep sense of peace. My neighborhood was a sanctuary of manicured lawns, silent streets, and absolute privacy. But tonight, that privacy had been violently shattered. As the black car turned onto my street, the sheer scale of the intrusion became undeniably clear. 2 blocks away from my house, the luxury vehicles began. Expensive sedans, massive SUVs, and sleek sports cars were parked bumper to bumper, practically choking the wide residential street. "Stop the car right here," I told the driver as we approached the edge of my property line. I handed him his cash tip, grabbed my bag, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. "I can take your keys right here, but just so you know, this is a private ticketed charity event. I need to see your invitation before you head up to the door." I stopped and looked the young man up and down. "I am not driving," I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth, "and I do not need an invitation to enter my own house. Step aside." The authority in my voice caused the valet to instantly freeze. He lowered his hand, his eyes wide with confusion, and quickly stepped out of my way. I walked past him and approached my heavy oak front door. It was propped wide open. A massive cascading floral arrangement of white lilies and red roses was draped over my entryway console table. The flowers alone must have cost thousands of dollars, undoubtedly paid for by the church benevolence fund she had tried to funnel my money into. I stepped over the threshold and walked into my foyer. The sensory overload was immediate. The subtle vanilla scent I usually kept in the house was entirely suffocated by the smell of heavy designer perfumes, expensive catered food, and spilled alcohol. From the backyard patio, the smooth, upbeat tempo of a live jazz band drifted through the open French doors. I walked quietly toward the kitchen, staying in the shadows of the hallway. My custom chef kitchen had been completely commandeered. A professional catering crew was moving frantically around my marble island. Men and women in crisp white coats were pulling hot trays of miniature crab cakes and stuffed mushrooms out of my double ovens. A bartender was aggressively chopping ice directly on my polished stone countertops. They were using my expensive custom cabinetry like a cheap commercial prep station. I watched a server load up a silver tray with crystal champagne flutes. They were my flutes. The Baccarat crystal glasses I had purchased in Paris to celebrate my 5-year wedding anniversary. I moved past the kitchen and positioned myself just behind the massive decorative pillar that separated the dining room from the main living area. I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire party. The custom furniture I had carefully selected to perfectly match the modern aesthetic of the house had been shoved carelessly against the walls to create a massive open floor space. Nearly 100 people were packed into the room. I recognized several high-ranking city commissioners, the local mayor, and the entire senior leadership of the church hospitality committee. The women were wearing lavish evening gowns, laughing loudly, and sipping my expensive wine. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were actively trespassing on a highly secured property. And then my eyes found her. Brenda was standing squarely in the center of my living room, positioned directly beneath the crystal chandelier, like a queen holding court. She was wearing an extravagant floor-length silver sequined gown that caught the light with every arrogant movement she made. She was draped in fake diamond jewelry, holding one of my crystal flutes, and laughing with the mayor-wife. I watched her gesture broadly around the room. I could see her mouth moving as she proudly pointed out the custom vaulted ceilings and the expensive hardwood floors. She was actively taking credit for my absolute hard work. She was basking in the admiration of her wealthy peers, feeding her insatiable narcissistic ego with the stolen reality of my success. I shifted my gaze toward the custom-built wet bar, tucked into the far corner of the living room. Greg was standing behind it. He was wearing a cheap rented tuxedo that looked 2 sizes too small. He was holding court with a group of older businessmen from the church, pouring generous measures of my incredibly rare $300 bourbon as if he had bought the bottles himself. Tasha was standing next to him, wearing a smug smile, acting like the perfect wealthy hostess. They were all in on it. They had completely invaded my sanctuary, convinced that my absence gave them the absolute right to steal my life for the night. They thought I was trapped in a hotel room in Chicago, entirely unaware of the massive violation taking place. I stood in the shadows, my heart beating with a slow, heavy, and terrifying rhythm. I did not feel the urge to scream. I did not feel the urge to run out and start throwing punches. I felt the absolute cold clarity of an executioner about to drop the blade. I reached into my bag and pulled out my cell phone. I made sure the high-definition audio recording of her extortion attempt was queued up and ready to play. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored travel suit, squared my shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows directly into the blinding light of her stolen stage. I stepped fully out of the shadows and into the bright ambient light of my own living room. The sheer volume of the party masked my approach. The jazz band was playing a lively tune and the wealthy guests were laughing loudly. I stood just a few feet away from the center of the room, my arms resting at my sides, watching my mother-in-law perform the greatest acting role of her miserable life. "Oh, the vaulted ceilings were my specific vision," Brenda announced to the local mayor and his wife. She was waving her crystal flute of champagne through the air. "I told my architect that I wanted a space that felt both expansive and intimate. It is the perfect second home. I let my son Andre and his wife stay here to help them get on their feet, but I simply had to reclaim it tonight for such an important charitable cause." The mayor nodded in deep admiration. "It is a stunning property, Brenda," he said warmly. "You have incredible taste. The community is so blessed to have your leadership." I shifted my gaze toward the custom wet bar. Greg was laughing aggressively at a joke told by a city commissioner. He reached behind the bar, grabbed a bottle of my incredibly rare imported bourbon, and poured a heavy measure into a crystal tumbler. He handed it to the commissioner with a smug grin, acting like a self-made billionaire hosting his peers at a country club. Tasha was standing right beside him, adjusting her expensive silk dress and completely reveling in the stolen luxury. They were parasites, feeding entirely on my hard work and claiming it as their own birthright. I took another step forward, my low block heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. I did not say a word. I simply waited for the inevitable moment when her eyes would find me. Brenda turned her head to gesture toward the kitchen, completely absorbed in her own magnificent delusion. And then she saw me. The transition was absolute perfection. One second, her face was glowing with absolute supreme arrogance, and the next second, the blood entirely drained from her cheeks, her mouth hung open, her eyes widened in sheer unfiltered terror. She knew I was supposed to be in Chicago. She knew my flight was not scheduled to return until Monday morning. She knew the biometric locks on the front door had kept her out. She knew she had authorized a violent break-in through my utility window. "Excuse me for just one moment," Brenda stammered to the mayor. Her voice suddenly sounded hollow and breathless. She practically sprinted across the room. She shoved past a wealthy church elder and nearly knocked over a waiter carrying a tray of crab cakes. She reached me before I could take another step toward the center of the party. Her hands shot out and she grabbed my arm with a desperate vice grip. Her long manicured nails dug painfully through the fabric of my suit jacket. She forcefully dragged me backward, pulling me out of the main living room and into the dark, narrow hallway near the powder room, completely out of sight from her prestigious guests. Her chest was heaving. Her face was a terrifying mask of panic and pure vicious malice. The heavy scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating in the tight space. "What are you doing here?" Brenda hissed. Her voice was trembling with rage and fear. "You are supposed to be in Chicago until Monday." "My flight was unexpectedly canceled due to severe weather," I replied smoothly. I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm until she slowly let go. Imagine my absolute surprise when I took a car service home and found a broken window and 100 trespassers drinking my rare bourbon. Brenda's eyes darted frantically toward the living room to make sure no one was watching us. She was completely unhinged, trapped in a corner of her own making. But narcissists do not apologize when they are caught, they attack. "You listen to me, Jada," Brenda whispered frantically. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. "The caterers are completely overwhelmed, and the food is getting cold. You are going to walk straight into that kitchen right now. You are going to put on a black apron, and you are going to help serve the guests. You will not say a single word to anyone about who actually owns this house. You will play the hired help." "And why exactly would I do that?" I asked, calmly crossing my arms. "Because if you do not play along and serve my friends tonight, I will walk right back out there and announce to the entire guild that your accounting firm is under active federal investigation," Brenda threatened. Her voice was a toxic sneer. "I will tell the mayor that you are a common criminal. I will tell them you are embezzling money from your clients and that my son is actively filing for divorce to protect our family name. I will completely ruin your reputation in this city before the night is over. You work for me tonight. Do you understand?" She was breathing heavily, her eyes burning with desperate greed. She actually thought she held the winning hand. She thought the threat of a massive public scandal would force me to submit. She believed I was so deeply terrified of losing my professional standing that I would put on an apron, lower my head, and serve crab cakes to her friends in my own hijacked house. She thought she could break my spirit and turn me into her maid. I looked at her shimmering silver sequined dress. I looked at the sheer panic hiding just beneath her threats. I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the audio application. "I understand perfectly, Brenda," I said softly. I turned my back on her and walked out of the dark hallway. I stepped directly into the blinding light of the main living room. I bypassed the confused looks of the wealthy guests. I ignored the horrified gasp from Tasha, who had just spotted me from the wet bar and dropped a crystal glass onto the floor. I walked straight toward the jazz band playing in the corner. I reached down, grabbed the main power cord connecting their amplifier to the wall, and pulled it completely out of the socket. The smooth, upbeat music died instantly with a loud, sharp screech. The entire room fell dead silent. 100 pairs of eyes turned to look at the woman in the tailored travel suit standing next to the band. The conversation stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. I reached over and picked up the main microphone from the microphone stand. I tapped it twice, the heavy thud echoing clearly through the massive room. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with absolute unshakable authority. "I would like to officially welcome you all to my home. And since my mother-in-law was just telling you all about the incredible architectural design of my ceilings, I think it is time we had a real conversation about family legacy and true ownership." The absolute silence in the room was deafening. The mayor-wife lowered her crystal flute, her eyes darting nervously between me and Brenda. Brenda stood frozen just a few feet away, her silver sequined gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume rather than a symbol of high society. She took a frantic step toward me, reaching her trembling hand out to grab the microphone from my grip, but I simply took a deliberate step backward. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the wealthy crowd. "Before we dive into the entertainment for the evening, I want to thank all of you for trespassing on my highly secured property," I announced smoothly. My voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings she had just claimed to design. "I am sure you were all under the impression that Brenda owned this beautiful estate. I am also sure you did not notice the shattered utility window in my rear laundry room, which she had someone break so she could bypass my military-grade biometric locks and move her party into my living room while she thought I was out of town." A collective gasp rippled through the 100 guests. The head of the church hospitality committee, a woman who had worshipped Brenda for over a decade, crossed her arms and frowned in deep confusion. The local politicians exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing they were standing inside an active crime scene. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords seemed entirely paralyzed by fear. She looked wildly around the room, desperate to find a single friendly face, but the crowd was pulling away from her. "Since my mother-in-law loves to boast about her immense wealth and perfect family, I think it is only fair that we put everything on the table," I said. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and tapped the screen mirroring icon. Directly behind Brenda, the massive 75-inch smart television mounted above my custom stone fireplace flared to life. It cast a bright, crisp glow over the stunned audience. I did not give Brenda the chance to recover or launch into a theatrical denial. I pressed play on my phone. The crystal-clear audio from my office security system blasted through the surround sound speakers of my living room. Brenda's own vicious voice filled the space with undeniable clarity. "I know how to ruin you, Jada. I will file a formal complaint with the licensing board. I will tell them you are committing financial abuse against your husband. Hand over the $50,000 right now, or I will make sure you lose your license." The mayor literally dropped his jaw. A prominent city commissioner set his drink down on an end table and took 2 distinct steps toward the front door. The audio was damning. It was the undeniable sound of a woman attempting to extort her own daughter-in-law for cash. "That is a lie!" Brenda finally shrieked. Her voice cracked wildly, echoing with pure desperation. "That is a fabricated recording. She used a computer program to fake my voice. She is a criminal trying to frame me. I smiled calmly and swiped my finger across my phone screen. The television display changed instantly. A massive high-resolution scan of a federal tax lien appeared, fully illuminating the room. There is no need for fabrication when the public financial records tell the exact same story, I announced into the microphone. Since Brenda was so eager to secure startup capital tonight, I think her guests should know exactly who is pouring their drinks. The man standing behind my custom wet bar is Greg. He is the husband of Brenda's perfect daughter, Tasha. For months, Brenda has been demanding I take out $250,000 loan against this very house to fund Greg's supposed tech venture. But as you can all clearly see on the screen, Greg is completely bankrupt. I zoomed in on the financial summary so the massive numbers were impossible to ignore. His trust fund is frozen, his last 3 businesses failed entirely, and he currently owes the federal government over $80,000 in unpaid taxes. He has been surviving by entirely maxing out Brenda credit cards. Greg dropped the bottle of expensive bourbon he was holding. It shattered violently behind the bar, sending amber liquid splashing across the polished wood and onto his rented shoes. Tasha covered her ears and began screaming at the top of her lungs. "Turn it off!" Tasha shrieked, tears ruining her expensive makeup, as her wealthy country club facade evaporated in front of her peers. Somebody turn the screen off right now, but nobody moved to help her, and I held the only remote control. "Please, Jada," Brenda begged. Her arrogant mask was entirely shattered. She was trembling from head to toe, holding her hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Turn the screen off. We will leave. We will all leave right now. Just turn it off and let us go." "You do not get to walk away from the fire you intentionally started, Brenda," I said coldly. "You broke into my home. You hijacked my property because your own utilities were shut off by the city due to massive unpaid debts, and you stood in my living room taking credit for my absolute hard work. So let us show everyone the grand finale. Let us talk about your pristine suburban estate." I swiped the screen one final time. The ultimate bomb dropped. It was the master deed to Brenda House. I used my fingers to zoom in heavily on the bottom paragraph, highlighting the section that clearly listed the sole lien holder. 2 years ago, Brenda was exactly 60 days away from complete public foreclosure, I explained to the completely silent room. Her house was going to be auctioned off on the courthouse steps. To save her from living on the street, I quietly purchased her debt through my private limited liability company. Look closely at the name on the screen. I am the sole lien holder. Brenda does not own that house. She has been paying rent to my company for 24 months to keep a roof over her head. The silence in the room was absolute. The grand illusion was completely dead. Brenda was not a wealthy matriarch. She was a broke, manipulative fraud, living entirely off the mercy of the daughter-in-law she had spent years actively trying to destroy. Brenda collapsed to her knees right in the middle of the hardwood floor. She covered her face with both hands, letting out a loud, pathetic wail. Nobody rushed to comfort her. Her prestigious friends simply stared down at her in utter disgust. "You crazy witch!" Greg roared. The humiliation was too much for his fragile ego to process. He vaulted over the side of the wet bar, his face twisted in violent rage, charging straight toward me with his fists clenched. I did not move. I did not flinch. Because before Greg could even take 3 steps across the open floor, the heavy oak front door swung wide open. Andre walked in. He had just returned from his architectural firm. He was still wearing his tailored suit jacket, holding his leather briefcase, standing frozen in the entryway. He took one look at the massive television displaying the deed, looked down at his mother sobbing on the floor, and then saw Greg charging directly at me. Andre dropped his briefcase. He moved faster than I had ever seen him move. He intercepted Greg halfway across the room, grabbing the larger man by the collar of his rented tuxedo and shoving him violently backward. Greg crashed hard into the marble kitchen island, knocking a massive floral arrangement onto the floor in a shower of water and petals. "Do not you ever take another step toward my wife!" Andre bellowed. His voice shook the very foundation of the house, vibrating with years of repressed anger. Greg scrambled to his feet, holding his bruised shoulder. He looked absolutely terrified of the raw rage radiating from Andre. Tasha ran over to her husband, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the back door, entirely desperate to escape the nightmare. Andre turned his back on them and looked down at his mother. Brenda reached her shaking hand up toward him, her face streaked with black mascara tears. "Andre, please," she whimpered. "She humiliated me. She humiliated your family in front of my friends." "You are not my family anymore," Andre said. His voice was no longer shouting. It was cold, final, and completely devoid of any remaining affection. "You broke into our home. You tried to steal my wife money. You lied to me for years. We are entirely done. Do not ever call my phone again." The mayor cleared his throat uncomfortably. He set his empty champagne glass down on a nearby side table and buttoned his jacket. "I think it is time for us to leave," he announced quietly to the rest of the guests. Within 5 minutes, the mass exodus began. The wealthy socialites, the church leaders, and the local politicians filed silently out the front door. They completely avoided eye contact with Brenda, who was still sitting on the floor in her ruined sequined gown. Nobody thanked her for the evening. Nobody offered her a ride home. They simply walked out, whispering furiously among themselves, permanently cementing her absolute social destruction. When the house was finally empty, save for the hired catering crew frantically packing up their equipment in the kitchen, Andre walked over to me. He gently took the microphone from my hand and set it down. He pulled me into a tight embrace, burying his face in my neck. He apologized repeatedly for ever doubting my judgment and for letting his family cross so many boundaries. The next morning, I did not hesitate. I contacted my corporate attorneys and instantly triggered a legal foreclosure on Brenda Estate. She had blatantly violated the strict morality and harassment clauses I had secretly built into our original bailout contract. Because of the clear evidence of her extortion attempt and the physical break-in at my property, the judge granted an expedited eviction. I gave her exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. With absolutely no money and her reputation completely annihilated in the city, Brenda was forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment downtown with Tasha and Greg. From what I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, the three of them immediately began tearing each other apart. Trapped in a tiny space with no wealth to hide behind, they suffocated under the weight of their combined debts and massive fragile egos. Greg eventually abandoned Tasha, leaving her and Brenda to fend for themselves while dodging relentless collection agencies. I never spoke to them again. I sold our suburban estate to a commercial developer for a massive profit and used the funds to open a second branch of my forensic accounting firm. Andre finally went to therapy, unpacked decades of generational trauma, and successfully started his own independent architectural design company. I sit here now on my back porch with Andre, watching the sun set over our manicured lawn. I am sipping the very last drop of that rare $300 bourbon. The new biometric locks hum quietly in the background, securing the perimeter of a home that is finally filled entirely with peace. I reflect on the long journey it took to get here. Protecting my peace required going to absolute war, but standing up for my own worth was the greatest investment I ever made. True family is built on mutual respect, not toxic entitlement. And sometimes, taking out the trash is the only way to finally breathe clean air. Have you ever had to legally evict a toxic family member from your life? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like and subscribe for more content about protecting your peace and building your own empire.